Ever notice your dog slowing down and having health issues and wonder, what can I do to make them better? Well, my friend, add Rough Greens to your dog's food for 90 days and I guarantee you'll see changes that will amaze you. Greetings, naturopathic Dr. Dennis Black, inventor of Rough Greens here, and I invite you to give your pup the Rough Greens 90-day challenge. In the first 30 days, you'll see shinier coats and increased energy. By day 60, your dog will have a stronger immune system, less shedding, improved joint function, all due to the live nutrients that you've added to their diet. And at 90 days, better digestion, reduced inflammation, improved heart health, and you may even have reduced their cancer risk. Fetch your dog a free Jumpstart trial bag today. Go to tryroughgreens.com. Use promo code TRYROUGH. That's TRYRUFF. Go to tryroughgreens.com. Use promo code TRYROUGH. You discover the shipping. You don't have to change your dog's food to improve your dog's health. Just add a scoop of Rough Greens.
Greetings, all CHP listeners across the universe. Laszlo Montgomery here. Today, I have another episodio especial for you. This one's for everyone who, like your humble narrator, is a big fan of historical novels rooted in Chinese history. I'm pleased to have my good friend, longtime listener to this long-running family program, and famous author Janie Chang on the CHP. Janie Chang is a Canadian best-selling author of historical fiction. Her latest book is The Phoenix Crown, co-authored with New York Times bestseller Kate Quinn. And her other titles are The Porcelain Moon, The Library of Legends, Dragon Springs Road, and Three Souls. Janie's novels often draw from a family history with 36 generations of recorded genealogy, including tales of ancestors who encountered dragons, ghosts, and immortals. Her novels also bring to light people or events which have been swept under the carpet of history. Janie escaped the high-tech industry to write historical fiction. Her novels have been Canadian national bestsellers and nominated for international literary awards. And her third book, The Library of Legends, which we are discussing today, was a Book of the Month Club selection in the USA. Born in Taiwan, Janie has lived in the Philippines, Iran, Thailand, New Zealand, and Canada. And she now makes her home on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of British Columbia with her husband and Minnie, a rescue cat who thinks the staff could do better. And Janie and I exchanged cat photos. I tried to palm one of my 4 kittens on her, but didn't meet with success. Fellow cat lover, Janie Chang, welcome to the CHP.
Thank you so much, Laszlo. And it's such an honor to be invited to this show, which I've been following for ages, and which really taught me a lot about Chinese history because having grown up in the Western education system, it wasn't like they gave you much in the way of Chinese history. So whatever I gleaned was sort of off my own initiative or listening to my parents and their friends talk about their childhoods. And you really filled in a lot of the gaps for me. So I thank you for that.
我不敢当. Well, we started talking about this when? Like 2-3 years ago. You see? 有志者事竟成. We made it happen.
Yeah, I think it was during COVID, and you were thinking that it wasn't just academics who had a lot of knowledge about history. It was also historical novelists, because we've been chatting about how much research I had to dive into every time I wrote a book.
When I was growing up, I discovered historical fiction and fell in love with the genre. It brings history to life, and in the hands of a great author, it could be an experience that sticks with you forever. What is it about historical fiction that makes it such an ideal medium to learn about history and historical people?
Well, I just think that when you read history in books, it can be kind of dry, and people are reduced to statistics, how many hundreds of thousands of this town died during the plague or something like that. But if your story allows the reader to zoom in on the experiences of an individual or their family or their community and how they suffered during the plague, then it brings everything more to life. You're sort of immersed in the history of that time. And if you do a good job, it's not just the history of that time, but also the social life of that time, what's considered normal behavior of that time. And so, what are your characters doing that are unusual or extraordinary to respond to this phenomena that's going on? I just think that if you can immerse the historical novelist reader in the world, in the time and the setting, um, what you have is historical novels as the gateway drug to history. Because how many of us have picked up a book about, oh, I don't know, Cleopatra and thought, how much of this was real, right? And then started reading the encyclopedia entries and started reading the nonfiction about it.
Did you read historical fiction when you were growing up?
I did, although I didn't know that's what it was called. We had neighbors, and their mother borrowed a lot of books from the library. And when she was done with them, she would pass them on to me. And I was a very fast reader, but she mostly read historical fiction and science fiction. And to this day, I have a deep and abiding love for both genres. And in fact, when I say I didn't even know I was reading historical fiction, I got to tell you, it wasn't until my second book came out that I knew I was writing historical fiction. Because when you're a newbie to the world of publishing, you don't realize that there are these categories.
So let me ask you, why did you leave a cushy, high-tech career to write books instead? Were you making too much money?
Yeah, no, I was not making too much money. My first degree was in computer science, and I had a wonderful career of working for tech companies and hardware, software, telecommunications. And I just kept on moving to jobs such as marketing communications, where my writing was being put to use because that's what I really enjoyed. It was what I called translating from geek to business English. But actually, I've always wanted to be a writer ever since someone pointed out to me that those books were actually created by people and you could be a writer. And what happened was in 2009, my mom had to go into care because she had dementia. And I would go and visit and look around, and I would see all these elderly people. And I would wonder how many of them had the chance to fulfill their dreams. How many of them are sitting there thinking, I should have tried harder to fulfill my dreams? And I thought, Janie, you better get your ass in gear and do something about this dream of wanting to be a writer. So I signed up for a creative writing program at Simon Fraser University. They have a really well respected writing program called the Writer's Studio. And my goal, because again, I was very naive, was that during my time at this 1 year program, I would write my first novel. And because you were supposed to bring a writing project to this course and have it workshopped and so on. And I got probably 3/4 of the way through by the time the course was finished, and I kept at it. But, it has been a lifelong dream, which keeps on getting pushed to the back of your life because there's so many other things. There's job and there's family and there's paying the mortgage. And as we all know, writing does not exactly pay the mortgage. So,
Well, not for everybody.
yeah.
Who did you enjoy reading growing up?
I really enjoyed the Bronte sisters. I read Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. And this is when I was 9 or 10 years old. And because my brother went away to university and left behind all of his books from high school, the required reading program. And of course, all the usual kids' books like Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and all the Dr. Doolittles and all the Chronicles of Narnia. And Jean Plaidy. That was my neighbor's mother's favorite historical novelist. So I learned all about British history by reading these Jean Plaidy novels, which looked like bodice rippers from the cover, but actually when I think about it now, they were actually pretty accurate.
Yeah, I used to read anything that was China history related, including all of James Clavell's books, which maybe now are difficult to read, but, back then those were I think, very inspirational to me and sort of pushed me in the direction I went. But anyway, let's look at your work. Your first book, Three Souls, takes place in 1935 China. And your second book, Dragon Springs Road, took place in 1908. Porcelain Moon takes place in 1918. Library of Legends opens in 1937. And The Phoenix Crown opens in 1906. So what is it about the first half of the last century that inspired you to write about that period in all of your books?
Well, first of all, from a writing point of view, fiction requires conflict in order to have an interesting story. And how much more conflict can you find than in the first half of the 20th century when it comes to Chinese history? Turbulent would be an understatement. The other thing is that this was an era where my parents and grandparents grew up. I never knew my grandparents, but when my parents would tell me about their childhoods in China during the Second World War and before that, and how their parents lived, it just became very, very vivid and alive to me. And so I guess I feel comfortable working in that era because I can picture it so clearly. When I'm writing some of those books and for example, I set Three Souls in the dusty little town of Pinghu, which is not a dusty little town anymore, by the way. It's a couple of hours drive south of Shanghai. It's quite a sophisticated town now. But back then, the way it was with the stone arched bridges going over the canals and, people taking their string shopping bags to the market, that is so real to me, and that makes it easier to write. But the other reason that those first 50 years are so interesting to me is, for me, there were so many inflection points when China could have turned out so differently. Before 1948, it was like it could have been anybody's game. The nationalists could have ruled China. The communists could have ruled China. You didn't know who the good guys were or who the bad guys were. It hadn't happened yet. So there's so much potential for characters to be sympathetic to one side or the other, or even maybe to the Manchu Empire. So it leaves all these possibilities for story.
So let's look at the Library of Legends. Anyone fascinated by Qianlong Siku Qianshu will love this one. It opens in the tragic and tumultuous year of 1937 during the early months of the Japanese invasion of China. And the story follows a group of university students who are forced to evacuate their campus in Nanjing and head inland to safety. So for anyone with a passing familiarity of that time in China, that's quite a backdrop to begin a story. So tell me about this book, The Library of Legends.
As you've introduced, it's about a university campus that's based in Nanjing. And fortunately for them, they get the heck out of Nanjing before the Japanese march in and occupy the city.
Did more than that.
Yeah. And part of their library is a very rare set of books called the Library of Legends. And to them, it's historical legacy. It stands for China at a time when China is under siege in so many ways, domestically and from foreign invaders. So it's a story of these students, focusing on one particular student who are traveling inland, going into central China and fleeing to safety. And all of them are assigned to carry one or two volumes of this very precious, precious book. And it talks about the internal sort of political issues that create conflicts between the students, because that was a time when both the nationalists and the communists were trying to recruit students to their side. And it talks also about the spirit guardians of China who are making a parallel exodus from the strife. And it finishes in Shanghai, which is taking in many, many refugees. So a lot of this is based on family history. And a lot of this is based on stuff I made up because it's fiction.
What's your personal connection to this story?
You know, my dad was one of these students. He was at university in Nanjing. He was with Zhejiang University, and his campus was one of 77 universities along the coastal side of China that actually became refugee campuses, traveling ever westward to safety. And he would tell me these stories about what it was like, how poor they were, how, he and his brother were so poor that they would go around to cooking fires with a tin can and pick up any ashes and coals that were still hot so that they could heat up their own meals. And I always thought that everybody knew about this chunk of history. And I was really surprised later on that people didn't know about it. People outside of China didn't know about it, and actually only people who were Chinese who had family that experienced this exodus of Chinese universities knew about it. And I think the inspiration that really made me think I need to write something about this was a friend of mine who had read the memoirs of one of these students. And this student was describing walking down the road behind all of them in a line behind their professor. And the professor was carrying on his back a chalkboard with the day's lessons written on them. So that even while they were fleeing and in danger of their lives, they were not going to give up their education because that was their duty to their family and to their country. And, the hairs just stood up on my arm. And I thought, I got to do something about this. And that and my father's various tales of his travels when he was a refugee student set me off on the path of researching for this book.
Yeah, 1930s and 40s China. So many great and unknown tales of survival. It
Yeah.
was such a period. In the course of your research, what did you discover?
Okay, so first of all, what I discovered was, wow, Daddy wasn't Daddy was telling the truth. This really happened because, I was reading memoirs and accounts that really corroborated everything that he told me. And the other thing that I discovered, very fortunately, was there was a book called Race the Rising Sun, which is another memoir of students from a different university who were doing this exodus, becoming a campus in exile. And they just mentioned in passing in the prologue that the librarian of one of the great libraries in Hangzhou had said to them, I have these 230 crates of this encyclopedia and really need to carry it to safety. Would your university do it? And I was thinking, this is crazy. So now I could possibly write about a university full of students who are not only fleeing for their lives, but also fleeing to save a national treasure. And, this library, in terms of metaphor, could just stand for so much. It had big legs that you could stand a story on. And it was a library of legends, which was all about the mythology of China. So that was just amazing because until I came across this gem, all I was going to do was going to write something similar to what had happened to my dad, but this just sort of coalesced everything and it gave it sort of a starting point for adding some fantasy into the novel as well.
What sort of research did you do that might surprise readers?
I think that people believe we research the heroes and the big lives and the dates of wars and battles and generals, and that stuff is easy. What's really difficult to research is the mundane, the daily, ordinary details of life. You know, when you were, okay, here's an example. When these students are walking 1,000 miles to safety, they would wear out their shoes. Of course, they would wear out their shoes, you know. And so, what did they do about it? And in one memoir I read, they would buy those peasant straw woven shoes and tie them over their leather city shoes, right, to protect them. And these are the tiny details. I nearly went crazy trying to figure out, how did you get mail from from your families when you were on the move all the time? And especially when my dad had told me that other students from wealthier families were able to receive money from their families, but his family was so poor, um, you know, there was just no way, and it was very hard to communicate. And that's when I discovered that it wasn't like the campuses were on the move all the time. They might stop for 2 or 3 months in one safe spot before they had to move on again. And during this time, they could, you know, write letters and exchange letters with their families. So just how do they receive mail was a big thing, and yet to us, it just seems so ordinary, right? So all these little ordinary daily sort of details of life.
Yeah, my kids are like, "God, how did you survive 30 years ago without the internet?" You know, and that's like hardly compares to those olden days. So, as a historical novelist, how do you decide what to fictionalize and what to include as fact, as actual history?
You know, if I really love what Hilary Mantel said about this, which is that 99% of history is not documented. Above all, the spoken word, because unless you were in that room and you heard what two people said to each other, then you don't really know what was going on. And so there are documented historical records, and then there's all the gray areas. And those gray areas is where novelists get to play. You know, I have a friend, Jennifer Robson, who explains it far better than I could. And she says it is what is possible and what is plausible. And the example she gives is in one of her books, Eleanor Roosevelt goes to wartime London during the Blitz, and in the novel, she meets a young American journalist named Ruby, who's working for a newspaper there. So, first of all, is it possible? Did Eleanor Roosevelt actually visit London during the Blitz? Yes, she did. That is recorded history. Is it plausible? As we all know, Eleanor Roosevelt really encouraged women to have careers and to stand up for themselves. So if Eleanor were to run into a fellow American woman, a young journalist, would she give her an exclusive interview? Yep, I think that's very possible. So in those gray areas, we try to play within the confines of history, but also we make stuff up, being careful to make it plausible. So whenever I look at things that have happened in history, and you can't really give you can't know people's motivations. So you could make up a motivation. Who's to know, right?
Psst. The best time to get permanent Everlights for your home is right now. You'll get the best price of the year. You'll get installed quickly. And with Everlights, you'll have the brightest and longest lasting lights year round. Show your colors for the 4th of July, for your team's game day, and you'll beat the Christmas rush. Best thing is no ladders or installer takedown for years and years to come. Everlights is your everyday lighting solution for your home or business. Click the banner for a free quote for the year's best deal.
So where can listeners find out more about this history behind the Library of Legends?
So the Library of Legends is based on a real national treasure in China, the Siku Quansu, which translates roughly as the complete library of 4 branches of literature. And I actually wrote a piece for Time Magazine about this, and Laszlo will have the link to it in the podcast, right? Yeah. So it was an encyclopedia commissioned by the Qianlong Emperor, and it was a project that lasted a decade. It was compiled and curated and edited by some of the greatest scholars of that era, of the Qianlong era. And it contained text from books dating from ancient times to the 18th century, organized in 4 broad categories of classics, histories, philosophy, and literature. And the complete collection ended up being some 77,000 chapters bound into 36,000 books, totaling about 800 million words. It was the largest encyclopedia in the world at the time, and it wasn't until 2007 that another encyclopedia and surpassed this word count, English Wikipedia. Okay.
Yeah, Qianlong Emperor, with his oversized ego, he had to have the largest encyclopedia ever produced in China.
Yeah, because the one before him was made by a Ming Dynasty emperor, was commissioned by a Ming Dynasty emperor. So it had to be like, well, my encyclopedia is bigger than yours kind of thing, right? So anyway, 7 sets were hand copied, and 7 imperial libraries were built in 7 different cities to house them. So unfortunately, over the centuries, war and fire, 3 copies were lost or partially destroyed. And then when China became a republic, volumes from the Wenlange Imperial Library in Hangzhou, which was the most complete set, ended up at the Zhejiang Provincial Library. And when the campus evacuated from Hangzhou, the students and staff brought the book with them. So that was the story that was alluded to in the prologue of these memoirs of students who survived the war. And they were, the university settled in the province of Guizhou, and they were there until the end of the war. And the books were actually stored in caves, safe from aerial bomb attacks. And 2 servants from the university stayed behind to guard them and care for them. And every year they would be taken out to dry in the sun and check for any kind of damage. So they survived the war in amazingly good shape. So what then happened was they went back and were housed at the Wenlange Library, which is now a museum in Hangzhou. And then in 2015, the Hangzhou Publishing Group, they completed a decades-long project to reproduce the Siku Quansu Encyclopedia. And the reproduction copies are now available for public viewing at the Palace Museum in Beijing, and the China also gifted copies to Stanford University and Berkeley University libraries. Yeah, and the if anybody's interested in getting hold of some nonfiction, there's a book called Race the Rising Sun, which is the reference book where I found mention of the Siku Quansu being transported by these university students. And then there's another book with a lot of photographs. It's called Teaching in Wartime China by, the last name is Gulick. Let me just check. It's a photographic memoir by Edward Gulick, who was an American teacher in China during the time of the Japanese invasion. So it was also about high school students and middle school students during the war, but the photographs in there really helped to inspire and evoke. And I will give those book names to Laszlo, and he can post them as well.
I certainly will. So after 5 books already under your belt, what do you think is the most difficult thing about writing historical fiction?
For me personally, it's when to stop doing the research. That's the first thing. Because when you love history and you're a history nerd, you could go down so many rabbit holes of research and you think you're being productive, and actually 6 months later, you realize you haven't written a single word. So that point of diminishing returns when you say to yourself, it's time to start writing, even though the research is so much fun and so fascinating. The second thing I think is difficult is because you're a history nerd and you love all this information that you're digging up and you've worked so hard to dig it up, it's how do you write this? How do you infuse this information in a way into your novel that does not overload your readers? You don't want your historical fiction to start sounding like a history textbook. So you just have to make sure that you're weaving it in different ways, just kind of drip feeding bits of information throughout the book, because that's really what gives readers the context of where your characters are living, when they are living, what kind of lives they experience, all the little details that give the story authenticity and richness, but without smacking them over the head with a bunch of dates and names of people. And then also the third thing is anachronisms. And by this, I mean anachronisms of behavior, not like, the movie where the Roman centurion raises his arm and there's a watch on it. I mean, do your characters behave in a way that's consistent to their upbringing, their family status in life, their wealth in life, their educational level, and the social mores of the time? Because if you have a character who's behaving in a modern way, a 21st century woman, for example, who's very liberal and progressive in her thinking, and you plunk her in the middle of 1910 China, that is an anachronism, because someone in 1910 China from a good family would not be necessarily well educated as a woman, would probably have no freedom in choosing who to marry. If they're come from a very conservative family, they may never see the outside of their courtyard home after a certain age. So if they are going to do something extraordinary and break out of their upbringing, what is it that's happened to them? What is it about their background that makes it plausible for them to break out of that, that very straightened, very restrained upbringing? So that's what I mean by anachronisms of behavior. So if you've done number 2 really well, avoiding the information overload and dripping in bits and pieces about the realities of living during that time, then when your character busts out or does something, you will help the reader to understand that this is actually something very courageous, very out of the ordinary, because you've already set the background for what is ordinary behavior.
And are there any other writers who you admire who are also writing historical novels rooted in Chinese history? Who else does a good job bringing Chinese history to life through their writing?
Top of my list would be my idol, Lisa C. She wrote books such as Snowflower and The Secret Fan and China Girls. And anyway, she is just a phenomenal storyteller and she does incredible research. But another series of books that I highly recommend is a trilogy about the Opium War by the author Amitav Ghosh. And the 3 books are Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, Flood of Fire. They are just so densely packed with history and characters and interesting observations about imperialism and colonialism. Just love that trilogy. Another author whose first book published the same time as my first book is Yangtze Chu. I believe she's Malaysian Chinese, but her first book, The Ghost Bride, was just the most gorgeous read. It's got elements of fantasy in it. And she's also written The Night Tiger and The Fox Wife. And I just love her writing. And on the fantasy side, I cannot recommend highly enough a book by the now, Barry Hugart, who has passed away, but his book, The Bridge of Birds, is set in an alternative ancient China, and it is phenomenal. When I first read it, I could not believe that Barry Hugart was not Chinese because, when people can tell jokes that sound like the jokes your dad would tell, they've done their homework. They've paid their dues. And one more, a lovely, lovely person, Wayna Dye Randall, who wrote a duology about the Empress Wu, who, as you may know from listening to Laszlo's podcast, was the only Empress of China who sat on the throne and ruled from the throne instead of from behind the throne. So she wrote The Moon in the Palace and The Empress of Bright Moon. And it's really questioning whether the Empress Wu was that bad or if it was the people who followed her who wrote history that made her sound really, really evil. And Wayna also wrote The Last Rose of Shanghai and The Night Angels. And to me, my hat is off to her because English is her second language, and yet she is a beautiful writer. So those are the authors.
Well, I'll have links to everything you mentioned, and everyone could check that out if they're so inclined. Your latest book was co-authored with New York Times bestselling author Kate Quinn. What's The Phoenix Crown about? And tell me, what was it like collaborating with another author on a book versus, the usual going it alone?
Yeah. So The Phoenix Crown is set in 1906 San Francisco, which was the year of their big earthquake. And during that earthquake, a lot of San Francisco burned down. So fire destroyed more of San Francisco than the actual earthquake. And Chinatown burned down totally, So when Kate approached me to write a book about set during the San Francisco earthquake, she said, but I really think what I need is a Chinatown heroine, because in all the novels, and in fact, all the novels that I've read too about the San Francisco earthquake, Chinatown barely gets a mention. And yet it was a huge part of San Francisco's history. So we started working together on a book about two characters who normally would never meet up. She wrote a Midwestern opera singer coming to San Francisco for a fresh start, and I wrote a Chinese laundress who is trying to escape an arranged marriage. And the Phoenix Crown refers to, those headdresses that the empresses of China used to wear, made of kingfisher feathers. And there is a wealthy collector in the novel who has one of these headdresses, looted from the Forbidden City, of course. And the story kind of goes from there, how these two women meet, how they have nothing in common, so they think, until they find out that they do, and actually it puts them both in deadly danger. And as for what it's like working with my friend Kate, well, the first thing that we agreed on was, even though we really wanted to write a book that we could be proud of and that readers would enjoy and would be entertaining and educational, we also wanted to still be friends by the time it was all over. So far more carefully than we would do writing solo, we plotted out the book and we figured out the process for collaboration. So fortunately, she was living on the West Coast at the time, so we were at least in the same time zone. But we got together a few times face to face and worked out the story, the overall story arc, and then chapter by chapter, rows on a spreadsheet. Excel spreadsheet really saved our butts on this one. But it meant that for every chapter, we knew how it began and we knew how it ended. She wrote one chapter from the point of view of her American heroine. I wrote the next chapter from the point of view of my Chinese American heroine, and we alternated. But in plotting it out so carefully, it meant that because we knew what had to begin and end for the next chapter, we could dovetail the action much more smoothly. The other thing that we would do was upload it to Google Docs. So we had a shared drive on Google Docs, and we would read each other's work and carry on with our own, upload, read, carry on. And it was actually pretty motivating, because you might dawdle when you're writing your own book, but if you're collaborating with an author who's as much of a workaholic as you are, there's no way you would ever let them down by not writing your chapter on time. So in that way, I think it worked out really well. The other reason it worked out really well is neither of us are morning people. So as I roll into my office at 10 a.m., I could be pretty sure that Kate was rolling into, opening up her laptop at around the same time. And, I would not be looking at guilt-inducing emails about, I posted my chapter at 5 this morning. Have you read it yet?
Minnie doesn't walk on your head at 5:30 in the morning to get you going?
Minnie, alas, is not a literary cat. Yeah. So what it was like was we were very careful, because where we heard other author friendships falling apart was during the editing stage, where people would start writing over each other's writing. So we were very careful just to put things in comment bubbles on the side and say things like, I believe that my character would respond much more violently to this particular incident. Do you think you could dial up the emotion here? That sort of thing, rather than redlining it. So it worked out really, really well for us.
So the Phoenix Crown is now out. So after you decompress from this latest effort, do you have anything in mind for your next project?
Well, Laszlo, the reason I'm able to do this podcast with you is because last week I handed in my latest manuscript to my editor, and it is called The Fourth Princess. And I may have mentioned earlier that I love books like Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, the Gothic. So this is a Gothic novel set in 1911 Shanghai. And it probably won't come out until 2026. But I'm feeling really relieved that it's done, or the worst part of it is done. And it's giving me time to think about my next couple of story ideas. So,
well, I hear a cacophony of meowing happening in my guest room next to where I'm recording this. I got 3 generations of cats living off my kindness and generosity, so I have to go give Smokesy her asthma medicine. So I think we're going to have to bring things to a conclusion. I'm so happy we finally did this. And I want to say to all listeners who have yet to explore the world of historical novels, it's such a great way to learn about history. When it's done well, you'll never forget it. Janie, thanks for coming on my little China history podcast show. And if you don't mind, I hope you'll come back again, and perhaps we can talk more about Chinese historical fiction. It's not a small topic.
Absolutely not, and it's full of conflict for fiction. And again, Laszlo, thanks so much for inviting me. It truly has been an honor.
Well, the honors was mine, I assure you. Okay, well, that's going to be it for this time. Janie Chang, thanks one more time. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the town of L.A. Please consider coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
Psst. The best time to get permanent Everlights for your home is right now. You'll get the best price of the year. You'll get installed quickly. And with Everlights, you'll have the brightest and longest lasting lights year-round. Show your colors for the 4th of July, for your team's game day, and you'll beat the Christmas rush. Best thing is, no ladders or installer takedown for years and years to come. Everlights is your everyday lighting solution for your home or business. Click the banner for a free quote for the year's best deal.